Recollection 1. The View. Section 1. The view up here is amazing, Patricia thought to herself. She stood upon a brief mesa lined with wild grass that lay thick and low like a green shag carpet. Beyond this mesa, the wilderness expanded for miles before being boxed in by the faintest inclination of mountainside. It presented as a sheer tide of waving greens and dark yellows topped off at the horizon by the jagged purples and airy blues of the mountains. It looked boundless, seemingly untouched and untamable by anybody. The only indications that anyone had ever lived in this wild place of wood and stone were the occasional decrepit shelters being eaten alive by the forest and time. This had always been Patricia's favorite place to meditate. It was private, away from the prying eyes of the monastery and anyone who'd upset or disturb her. She had company in the form of a single worn oak just beside the rocky entrance. It had been her sparring partner ever since she'd been kicked out of the dojo. A shallow stream that cut off a third of the mesa held cool, pure water that she would drink and bathe in. To her knowledge, the monastery didn't have running water. This place felt special to her. For just a moment, as she stared over the edge of the mesa, she thought of the other people who may have been here before her. Those homes and shelters so green with vine and other growths they could hardly be parsed from the rest of the forest. What happened to those people? It seemed ironic to her that the monastery felt just as old as those ruins out there. Some of them were probably younger than the monastery. They all came and went, but the monastery still stood here. A faint snow came off the mountaintop above her. It had been just a flake that passed in front of her face. It existed, tiny and invisible in the grass, much like Patricia herself when she went out in the forests. In a way, she seemed a lot like that flake of snow, cold and alone in a world that would kill her in a heartbeat. She thought of herself as anything but a snowflake, though. She thought herself a durable thing with purpose in her existence. She didn't come this far down the mountain simply to gawk at the wilds of Duron, though it was an awesome sight. She had come to hunt. Her task, her chore for the evening, was to find something to eat in the forest. If she put meat on the monks' table, she would be successful. She did not intend to fail them. She took in the picture-perfect sight for just a moment longer, with its rolling clouds and mountainous outlines. Soon enough, she climbed down the steep edge of the mesa, and melted into the forest as the snowflake did the grass. Whereas the snowflake faded away to become one with the grass, she did not have the luxury of such a fate. The cold of winter was on its way, and though it couldn't be felt yet, she'd sooner be caught dead before being unprepared for something. It was the type of person she was. She always had a plan. Hours were spent in the thick of that wide and wild forest. Patricia had known for a time now what to eat and what not to eat, as well as how to move through the trees and the brush and avoid any unwanted attention, or attract it should she so desire. She modeled a stubborn student in the best of ways. Her movements through the forest would have made an elf blush. Her blue-gray jumpsuit was slim on her body, yet betrayed not her sex. Her scarlet hair was tied high in a ponytail. It flowed behind her like the tail of a fox playfully chasing a muskrat. Upon her brow stood a clutch of feathers in an old and thin leather wire. The feathers were mostly reddish finch feathers and cardinal feathers. They numbered 20 total, and circled her head as light as the sun. The cleats on the boots she wore were perfect for the uneven terrain of Duron. A slight furred top led down leather laces to broad and shallow spines that could dig into rock or ice, yet did not carry away much in their wake. There was one last, absolutely essential component to her outfit. Her gloves were white once upon a time, but years of use had left them stained a sort of cream color. They afforded her all the dexterity she needed while protecting the world from her powers. She demonstrated the practicality of her attire by swiftly climbing up a large chinkapin tree and gathering its nuts. Tasks like this were routine for Patricia ever since she'd first come up the mountain to become part of the monastery. This was her favorite sort of job. She very much enjoyed romps around the forest like this, skimming the fat of the land and foraging whatever her mentors needed. It was dangerous to be out alone in the woods like this, but they either didn't care or trusted her enough to let her roam free. Other than hunting and gathering, she also had the inglorious duty of keeping everything tidy around the monastery. She played maid for most everyone there. Anybody else would have considered it a raw deal. Not her, though. She didn't hate the job, far from it. She loved being useful to someone, and she was proud of the clean she would make of the place. Even so, nothing could compare to the forests for her. Out here, she was alone. There was nobody around to judge her methods or try her hair-themed patience or shout curses in her face. It was just her and whatever other wild shadows danced in the darkness of the falling leaves. Those shadows, those fleeting things that frolicked from tree to tree with all the grace of the blue bird of happiness, had always held a distant love for her. For some reason, those shadows made her feel more at home, more loved, more human and more curious than almost any other real person ever had in her life. Almost. There was one. He was family to her. She strongly felt that she'd left her family behind. Nowadays, the shadows were her family. So she banished those old thoughts and danced with the darkness that loved her in the big manor of a forest that was her home now. Patricia visited the trees she had skipped on her last romantic journey through the woods. This time she got lucky in a couple of ways. Luck was a rare thing for her if you asked her about it. Firstly, there was a large bird's nest within one of the many trees she had visited. She pitied this family of birds. The nest was heavy with egg, and yet it lied unattended. Pilfering tomorrow's breakfast was easy, and when she took a look below herself after pocketing the eggs, she knew why. This was her second stroke of luck. Beneath her hissed and slithered a sizable rock eel. Its skin was slick like that of a slug, and it mawed down on the unfortunate whip-poor-will that was mothering the nest. It was 3 meters of beady-eyed, camel-patterned meat. At the distance she was at, she could hear the crunch of the whip-poor-will's bones as the slimy beast re-hinged its jaw and sent the bird further down its meaty gullet. The creature then slid from one branch to another, ignorant of the human girl above it. Patricia was intimidated by the size of the thing. Anybody would have been, especially so close to it. However, she also saw an opportunity to pass the final lesson her mistress was trying to teach her. It was another beast for her to test her mettle against. Patricia's agile mind already worked out a plan. She knew she had to get the first hit in. She well and truly believed that old adage of victory being decided before the battle is fought. She'd never gone into a fight she didn't believe she could win, and had fought enough people and beasts to know that the adage was true. Patricia needed a surprise attack to beat it. She couldn't win a direct fight against this thing, even with her powers. Bracing herself a bit, she took one of the eggs she had retrieved and placed it in her mouth. It was an essential part of her training, so she was told. She then took off one of her gloves and placed it in her pocket. The air always felt warm to her skin, and already a slim amount of dew budded upon her knuckles. Such was her power. She held her fist tighter. The dew budding on her hand solidified. It didn't bother her. She firmly grasped a small branch with her bare hand. It became brittle and cold. Patricia snapped the branch. The eel snapped at her. She snapped the eel. The hit was quick, clean, and accurate. What was left of the vile creature slumped to the ground slowly. Nothing but a stump remained of its head. Not a drop of blood came out of the frostbitten nub of its neck. Patricia was as brisk as the wind that rolled off the tops of the mountains themselves. She had landed knee and fist on the ground, and rose up scraping the frozen blood of the eel off of her hand. Disgust was then apparent on her face. It was bitter and slimy. She slowly pulled a large piece of broken eggshell out from between her lips with her gloved hand. It was a bad habit of hers to tense up when she got serious about things, particularly her mouth. She ground her teeth when she got angry. That's why she found this training so difficult. Of all the things she had to do to advance, this was among the more unusual and perhaps cruel of the lessons. She begrudgingly chewed and swallowed the rest of the egg, angry at herself for letting it break in her mouth when she had perfect control of the situation. She then remembered the rest of the rock eel as its body slumped limply to the ground with a wet crashing sort of noise. This eel's meat was what she needed. She picked up the length of the creature and slung it over her shoulders like a slippery scarf. She was content with the haul from this hunt as she went back to the mountainside. Along the way, she froze and snapped off the needles of a pine tree before wolfing them down. She wanted to taste something other than raw egg and half-developed chick for her climb back up. On her way back up, however, she ran into a rather unsavory customer. They met with their eyes and stopped when they saw each other. She immediately knew that this was no ordinary beast of the forest. It was shaggy and had claws. It was the size of a man with the head of a dog. Its gold eyes gleamed with unnatural light. The beast bellowed and stood up on its hind legs. What muscles it had. She knew it intended to rob her of the rock eel the same way the eel robbed the poor Will of its entire life. She took the eel off of her neck. She laid the kill down in front of herself and cracked her knuckles. The beast didn't budge at all. It just stood there as if to mock her. She took off her second glove and clenched both of her fists tightly. The frost of her powers quickly became evident on the back of her hands and knuckles. She narrowed her focus. Her legs swept in front of her as she took a fighting stance. She steadied her breathing just as she had been doing for the past 5.5 years. She exhaled smoothly. Patricia charged the beast and landed a solid punch in its gut. It growled as Patricia's expression turned from uneasy confidence into panic. Her hit didn't seem to have any effect. The beast pawed the side of her head like a drunken parent would a disobedient child, and like a toy in that child's hand, she flew away to her right and landed with a heavy thud. Now she was belly up like some sort of submissive dog. There was an intense pain coming from the right side of her head, and she couldn't see out of her right eye. Before she had time to think about what just happened, the beast bore down on her body with its nightmarishly toothy jaws. It was going to disembowel Patricia if she didn't do something quickly. She interrupted the beast's attempt at her life and limb by pawing its nose, and shortly after punching it square in the eye. The furred face of the foul beast froze when Patricia's fists made contact. It gave her just enough time and room to dig the spines of her cleats into the guts of the beast, right into the same place she had struck before. It recoiled a meter or two, holding its belly as it did. The two of them eyed each other, sizing up the competition after the line between hunter and hunted had been blurred. Already it cost them both an eye and possibly a rib as well. Patricia could heal her wounds, though. There was medicine and magic back at the monastery. The beast's wounds would only get worse. The forest isn't a kind place. Those wounds would fester with painful infection. It could take months to heal that up. The beast made the first move. Patricia reflexively backed away as the beast sprung. It wasn't moving to hit her, though. It limped away into the forest as quick as it could, bleeding as it bound its way away from her and the scene of the fight. The beast had decided to cut its losses, and Patricia was almost offended by this. Wasn't she worth its time? Wasn't she worth fighting over? She took a moment to look herself over. She didn't get out of this fight unscathed. The hit to her head was a heavy one. It knocked the sight out of her right eye, or so she thought. She put her gloves back on and felt over her face. She shuddered when she pulled her hand away and saw her own blood. To Patricia's horror, her eye was gone. A brief panic ensued. She combed that patch at the base of the mountain where she'd fought the beast over and over and over again. It was gone, gone, and she couldn't find it. After 15 minutes of searching, she gave up. She went to retrieve the headless corpse of the rock eel. It had gotten cold. She draped her trophy about herself just as she had done before so as to carry it up the mountain more easily. Just when she was going to start up the cliff face, she caught a glimmer coming off of the spot where the beast had tried to eat her. Investigating that spot, she smiled with delight. It would seem her counterattack had caused enough damage to knock the beast's own eye from its head. She picked it up and examined her little spoil of war. This was no ordinary eye. It was made of glass, held the same phthalo blue as her own eyes. She found it somewhat disturbing, but decided in the end to keep it for herself and started up the mountain proper. The climb up the mountain to the monastery was already brutal by any normal standard, especially in the waning hours of the day. Over 700 stone steps came modestly off of one narrow road that made sure that only those truly willing and determined ever set foot on monastery ground. That was not Patricia's path this day, though. She intended to climb back up the cliff face to the mesa from whence she came. This was going to be even more difficult with just one working eye. The sun was setting across the forest below. She didn't have much time before the long shadow of distant mountains would slice the day away. It would be impossible to go the rough way she'd come from in the state she was in if the night set around her. She climbed as quickly as she could back to her mesa. She did slip up here and there and start to fall once or twice, but her strong hands always caught the cliff before the fall became terminal. It didn't take long for her to reach her little mesa again. Once more, Patricia's eyes crossed the edge of the mesa she was on and explored the wide world outside. She sat down on the edge to rest for a moment and lamented the loss of her eye. In spite of her loss, the world was no less magnificent to behold. The shade of distant night and oncoming winter clouds, dyed purple by the orange sunset, only added to the dreamy allure of the forest below. Though she knew much of the land beyond her perch, she still felt that it was all infinite. Out here, away from the concrete and steel of city sprawl, there was no such thing as gold or greed. There was peace, whether in the shade of the mountainside or beneath the shadow of the roof of the forest. Even as the ever-loving darkness loomed and the first snow started to fall, and her wounded face dripped with hot blood as the thought of sleeping there seemed more and more appealing, the view was still just as good with one eye as it was with two. She needed a real bed, though. She also needed medical attention to keep her wounds from becoming a burden. The sun crept farther past the final stretch of the mountains that walled everything in, as Patricia herself crept further up out of the mesa and onto her own mountain. She walked hand in hand with the night, as if she had been wed to the darkness itself. The sun and her found retreats on the opposite sides of the world. One blazed a trail over the jungles of Priam, while the other found respite for tomorrow's tasks in the land of Duron. The world was still cold and lonesome to her, just as it always had been. Darkness was her bedfellow. Nobody else.